Hi. Welcome to Someone Else's Movie, the original podcast where an actor, writer, director, or nebulous industry figure gives a little love to a movie they didn't make. I'm Norm Wilner, TIFF's Senior International Programmer for Canada, and this is The Other Thing I Do. My guests this week are Rachel Kempf and Nick Toti, two very charming people from Kirksville, Missouri, who've been taking film festivals by storm with It Doesn't Get Any Better Than This, a film that played TIFF last month and is a really smart, really fun, and genuinely unsettling found footage movie. It continues rampaging across the continent, screening this week in St. Louis at the Arkaden Cinema on Friday, October 18th, and at Aorta in Kirksville on Saturday the 19th. It's also at the Grand Illusion in Seattle on October 25th, and wherever you see it, it's going to be a great time. Tickets are available at diediebooks.com. Just click on the Die video tab for showtimes and locations. Rachel and Nick picked Hostel, Eli Roth's 2005 tale of some American bros in Europe who decide to check out an elite club in Slovakia that promises unimaginable debauchery, only to find out that they won't be there in the roles they were hoping. Maybe one of the most notorious titles in the torture porn wave of post-9/11 horror, it was immediately controversial and also just as immediately dismissed as another cheap exploitation picture, which it is, unapologetically, unless it isn't. That's where Rachel and Nick come in. This is Someone Else's Movie.
Well, I mean, and part of it has to do with some of the audience reaction we got at TIFF. So prior to TIFF, we had been getting just almost a universally positive reviews. We were pretty much exclusively playing it at like horror festivals or like people who have like a horror night at their independent theater. And a lot of them were like, I just love hanging out with these dorks. And then at TIFF, we got a number, it was much more divisive, and a number of the negative reviews were like, I hate these characters. Like, I hate them so much. I can't stand to be around them. And part of that, and also a very like, fuck these people for making this movie, which we felt is very akin to the reaction to Hostel. A bit like people really, really dislike the characters and really seem to hate Eli Roth for having made the movie. I mean,
but we've always loved the movie, and I've always had this. There have been certain at various points in my life as like a movie lover, I've had other people who I totally respect their opinion, and they will talk about this movie, and when they say the things that they feel critical about with the movie, it's as if we watched two totally different movies. Like they'll say, like, they'll use the word just, like they'll say like, oh, it's just torture porn, or it's just like he's just going for shock value or whatever. And I don't feel like there's anything that's not really pretty carefully considered about the movie. Like I've always thought that it was a really sharp movie, a really smartly made movie. I do think that there's stuff that it's fair to be critical about it, but for me it would be like really kind of piddly, like really snobbish things. Like now watching it, I'm slightly less enamored with it now than I used to be, but like that's because I think I'm more of a snob now, and I'm like, oh, well, Eli Roth maybe isn't like the most stylistically like advanced director, but like, like that's a pretty in the weeds argument to be making over a gory horror movie. But yeah.
And I mean, like the characters, I don't think I'd want to be friends with these guys, but like they do. I mean, they use language. They say things that I wouldn't use. I wouldn't care to hang out with people too much that were,
But also in 2005, we were hanging out with people like that.
Honestly, it was a different. Well, and I mean, the other thing, they have their own. They are like funny, like. At times, I don't find them not entertaining to watch. And it is a movie that like, I have an MFA in screenwriting. It's got one of the most, like, it most closely follows just like classic screenwriting structure. So it was like there with like the character arc of like Paxton. So it was like, I was sort of weirded out when I saw it and I was like, oh man, what a great screenplay. And people were like, it was just torture the whole way through. Why, like,
terribly written.
Yeah, everyone, terribly written, terrible dialogue. And I'm like, I feel like I've heard this like, this feels like very realistic dialogue for a certain type of dude, like in their like 20s. Like it feels, it's not, it doesn't feel unrealistic at all to me. Yeah, so I don't know. Well, I think it's a really, like, it's a smartly written and interesting piece. But yeah, that was why we chose it, the divisiveness.
And also just I think just kind of saying it's a movie that it's never been hard for me to find people who hate it. But I don't really hear a lot of people just like out there advocating for it. So we wanted to be the people advocating for Hostel.
Push back a little bit against, yeah, because there's definitely, like, I think a lot of stuff to admire in it. So yeah, if we weren't divisive enough already, like, come at us, haters.
I do think that's kind of Eli Roth's pitch, though. Come at me, haters. Like, his whole thing is he's not a provocateur because he enjoys the stuff he does too much. I've met him a couple of times over the years, and we run a panel together, I think when Cabin Fever was at TIFF, maybe? That's like 20 years ago. But he is really, really good at giving audiences what he wants to give them, which I think is why people respond badly to his films sometimes, because he really only wants to do the thing he wants to do, right?
Well, and he implicates the view. He does something that I think is very interesting, and I can understand why. It's something that we do in our movie too a bit, that like he kind of punishes the viewer for the emotions that they're having, which I think is great. Like, I think is really smart. Like, you're at the beginning, like at a certain point in the movie, you're like, if you latch on to any character, you're like, I guess Josh is a nicer guy than these other people. Like, if I can latch on to anyone, it's him. You think he's the protagonist, boom, dead, like halfway through. If you Paxton starts to become like a bit of a more admirable character as the movie goes on. He's, like, okay, now I don't just care about getting laid. Now I want to find my friend. Now I'm escaping this place, but I'm going to go back and like help this girl. But by the end of the movie, he's also like cutting a dude's fingers off and like murdering him in the toilet. Like, it really, like, it kind of implicates the viewer in their, like, there's a part of you, if you're a horror fan, that's always wanting gore, and it kind of punishes you for that. And I think that's like smart.
It also punishes you like from a, like cis hetero male perspective. Like, the movie punishes you for, because that's another thing, like the movie is, and I think that there is some argument to be made that the movie is misogynistic. It doesn't really have any female characters that are like really characters. But then he made Hostel 2, and that's I think
the female characters are great in Hostel 2. Like, I don't know. Also, what I will say about...
Wait, I gotta finish talking about misogyny. Quiet, woman, I'm talking about misogyny. Anyway, as a man who gets turned on by naked women, I then get punished for that by seeing men who were ogling naked women get tortured at the end of the movie.
Well, yeah.
That was all I was going to say.
Not just tortured, but it's like the same, like, if you're out here objectifying the women that, like, they're having sex with, and if you are the type of viewer who's like, ooh, you can do anything, like you can pay for anything out in Slovakia, and then you realize what you can pay for anything in Slovakia means, like, literally, like, torturing somebody is objectifying them in the same way that, like that the guys are objectifying women at the beginning of the movie. So it's like, not for nothing. I will say the homophobic thread, it may be for nothing. It's
I don't think so. I think that Josh is being set up as being possibly closeted gay.
Well, that was like one thing that I was like, this is, if I can justify this, I would say it is entirely, I've never thought that before, but this viewing, I was like, there is a chance that he is being like coded, but I don't.
I think he definitely is. We rewatched the movie the other day, and then last night Rachel went out and I rewatched it again. So I've watched it twice in the past like 72 hours.
Right.
But this time I really paid attention to it, and I think it's definitely there and it's definitely intentional. I don't know that the character is actually supposed to be closeted gay, but it's definitely exploring that as a possibility. And I think that I would argue the reason for that being, or what the value that it lends to the movie, is that it's at least offering the opportunity to interpret all the like hyper machismo male bromance elements of it as being the result of repressed sexuality.
Right, performative.
Yeah.
And
so again, it's like, I think that all these things that people have, in my experience, held up as being, oh, these are just things that are thoughtless about this movie, or things that make this movie something that I don't like, I actually think are actual decisions that have been made and have been done carefully. And like, we've been watching this movie for 19 years now, 18 years, whatever. And like, we're only just like really thinking about these elements of it now. So
yeah,
it's dated remarkably well in that it is a snapshot of attitudes at the time. Like, it almost felt then like it's a movie that I could never figure out how to properly make this statement, but it felt to me like a movie that the guys from Entourage would really love, but also that they would end up in. Like, it's
yeah.
If you're rooting against Entourage, this is where they end up. They, like, Turtle goes on a European vacation and never comes back or something. But there is a sense definitely that, what's Paul's line in After Hours? I just wanted to meet a girl and now I got to die for it. Like, that's the logical endpoint of this, that they are there to treat women like meat and they get treated like meat themselves. It's the most simple thing, right? Like, it is so simple and direct that people forget that horror movies don't need to have subtext. Like, Halloween doesn't have subtext. It's a machine. It's a shark. And this is kind of working on the same level, where these guys are in trouble from the word go. They're not coming out of this the same, if at all. And the women don't do so well either. Like, everybody is just ultimately butchered. And it's just, I don't know. Yeah, Paxton has an arc in that he goes from victim to survivor, and that he embraces violence, but he doesn't have a big speech about how he doesn't believe in hurting people, right? Like, there's nothing to him until he acts.
He is a vegetarian.
And it is. There are these like little things that are like sprinkled through the movie where it's like, I think in a lot, like, so if it was a slasher movie, I don't think people would complain as much about like how detestable these characters are. But like, I almost want to argue there's like slightly too much character development, and that's what makes not like too much character development for the movie, but like there's more character development than there would have been in a slasher movie, and I think that's what makes people kind of viscerally respond negatively to it, because there are all these moments where it's like, oh, Ollie has a kid, oh, Paxton's a vegetarian and he knows like multiple languages, wouldn't have expected that about him. Like, there's just all these weird things that are sort of peppered through, and there's also like weird little like things, some of those little things just like set up and pay off really well, which is like a little more sophisticated than I think the movie gets credit for, where it's like, I don't know, you're like, oh, Ollie has a kid. Oh, later, like, oh, how well did we know Ollie? Or like, oh, Paxton speaks German, and then that comes back later. Like, there's nice little setups and payoffs like sprinkled throughout. The thread with the kids and the candy is
the gang of kids.
One of my favorite things in the movie. It's very akin to my favorite thing in Cabin Fever, which is Party Cop, where it's like it just emerges multiple times and then you finally get the big payoff for it. But every time it shows up, it's just funny. And like and weird. And yeah, and just adds this bizarre element to the world. But yeah.
Yeah, one of the things Rachel was just saying reminded me of something I was thinking about with the movie, which is that, there what it reveals to me for the fact that when I watch it, I just find the characters, I don't find them admirable, but I am charmed by them as characters, and I find them funny. And when they say horrible things, I do laugh at it. But it started me thinking about, like, are these anti-heroes, which they're not really anti-heroes in the, like, I guess I'll just say, like, the pompous sense. We were Rachel and I were talking when we watched it the other night about how, you could kind of make this like a spectrum of anti-hero, and on one end is like Shakespeare's Richard III, and on the other end is like the protagonist from Frank Henenlotter's Frankenhooker, which we also watched the other night. And if you with something like Frankenhooker or a trauma movie, all the characters are over the top, just these complete two-dimensional cartoons. And so when bad things happen to them, you're laughing at it, you're rooting for it. You're also rooting for them to do terrible things. That's what you're there for. Then you can take a step over and maybe you get like the protagonist in a slasher movie, which is dumb teenagers. You're not really rooting for them. You're not really rooting against them. When one of them triumphs in the end, you cheer, but when they get killed, you cheer also. It's but it's not as cartoonish as the trauma characters. Then you have something, I think Hostel is sort of right in the middle, before you get to like your Tony Soprano or your Shakespeare characters or whatever. Like in Hostel, it's like, who are these guys? Like they're kind of they flirt with three-dimensionality, but while still remaining human grotesques, and but I think that's also part of being like a 20-year-old guy, is that's the last time it's socially acceptable for you to be a complete bonehead, like to be a completely grotesque version of yourself, where like you don't need to really be paying any attention to anything other than your base human desires. And like society doesn't really punish you for that unless if you transgress certain things, like but then 5 years later, I mean, it's even in those characters. Like Josh wants to be a writer, probably planning on going to grad school. Paxton wants to be a lawyer. He says that I'm going to be taking the bar. So 5 years from now, these guys, if they had not gone through what they go through in the movie, they would have been probably somewhat toxic members, but functional members of society. But yeah, so like we're getting them in this window where like they can still be idiots and still live as if there's no consequences to their actions. And I think that that's fun to watch. Like it's fun to engage with that because yeah, it's nice to see people who you like recognize as being believably human, but also are not in any way dealing with the sort of adult responsibilities or like the understanding that there's going to be consequences for their action. Even just the idea of backpacking through Europe, like that whole idea is like, oh, I'm going to take 2 months and nothing that I do during that time matters, but I'm going to remember those things for the rest of my life.
Right, like Rumspringa, like you get to make your mistakes unsupervised. Watching it again made me think weirdly, it's like Clint Eastwood remade the first half in 1517 to Paris. Like it's just about, only that's even weirder because this is a movie about the 3 guys who were on a train and stopped a terrorist incident because they were American. And he got the real guys to play themselves. And it's not a good movie. It's really not, but it's a fascinating exercise in reenacting your own trauma. And the weirdest scenes are the scenes where these guys just pretend to go and buy gelato at the place where they bought gelato the day this thing happened. And they're reenacting it, and they are the least comfortable people on the planet ordering gelato because every line is fake. They're doing they're reenacting their own lives, their own moments, and they can't be convincing. And I thought like this time through, it's just like, yeah, okay, if there hadn't been a terrorist incident on the train, that obviously nobody makes a movie about it, nobody talks about them, but they're just, they'd have forgotten that trip themselves. Like the gelato thing is not memorable. It's only memorable because of what happened next. And the whole first 30 minutes of Hostel is that. It's just a bunch of guys doing guy stuff. And yeah, you're right. They wouldn't think back on it. I mean, they'd think back on it fondly, but they wouldn't remember it specifically. And they'd probably have a lot of, uncomfortable memories about the way they behaved if they'd survived. But instead, it's just the prelude to this trial of everything they are and everything they believe in. And yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe we get just a little too much complexity. We definitely do in the sequel, the way that it paints the relationship between the two leads before it all goes to hell. I think you're right. I think Roth gives people a little more than they want from a two-dimensional slasher movie because he's not making slasher movies. It is, insofar as torture porn is a thing, and specifically of that window in time where the Saw movies kind of inaugurated this whole grotty, grotesque, self-inflicted, your moral sins are the reason you have to tear your body apart mentality and also get hepatitis from the set. The Hostel films are the slicker version of that, right? Because they're just as art directed and they're just as Baroque, but they're not cruel in the same way. Like they're less cruel and more cruel at the same time by having no relationship between the torturers and the tortured.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that's interesting about Hostel, I haven't watched Saw 2 recently. We have seen like literally every Saw. We'll just, if have horror movies in the theater that are downtown Cinema 8 in Kirksville, we'll just go see like literally any horror movie in Kirksville. So we've ended up, and now at this point, it's like, well, we've gotten this far with Saw, we might as well just write it.
Yeah, no, I'm a completist with Saw.
I actually have a pitch for a Saw sequel. If you ever get the offer to do a Saw movie, and I could actually see that happening the way IP works nowadays, escape rooms. Like imagine a Saw, like in a world where they know Jigsaw because he's already a legend. Would you believe any of it if you woke up in a Saw room with other people?
Yeah, that's great. I love that.
I've also got a pitch for a Saw movie, but it's set far in the future, and it's basically that you have to imagine a world in which John Kramer as Jigsaw was effectively like got a cult formed around him.
Yep.
And then 2,000 years in the future, he's essentially a Jesus Christ figure, and build a world where that's a dominant religion. And that it takes place in that world. I don't know where it goes from there, but
well, I mean, the flagellation would be pretty Catholic. You could definitely pass on those
he's
qualities.
Got disciples is the thing, and so you just like if you get enough, like if John Kramer has 12 disciples, like why couldn't there be 2,000 years from now a religion based on it? But yeah,
that's amazing. This is my rock. I want you to put it in your eye.
Yeah. No. Well, as far as like the torture goes, Hostel. The thing that struck me this time watching it is that like there are a number of scenes where, and I don't know if we're just way more desensitized now or what, but I was like, this actually isn't as gory as I remember it. And a lot of it's just where he points the camera, like the kills with Josh, all the torture with Josh. So much of it is off screen. It's like you'll see a drill going into a very close up of flesh. A lot of the other stuff he like hacks at him, but you don't like see it. It's like you hear his reaction.
Even like the Achilles
tendon is like
off screen.
Yeah,
until you see him stand up, and then you see the wound separate.
Yeah, so there were a number of things that were off screen that I was like, oh, I didn't remember that being off screen. And then the other one that really struck me that I was like, well, no, this is actually a pretty smart decision, is the one with where it's probably the grossest part of the movie where he's like cutting the girl's eye off because she's like freaking out. The eye. Oh God. So the camera spends a lot more time on Paxton's reaction to having to cut this thing off than the girl's reaction to having her eye cut off, which you would expect it to be, I feel like, the other way around. Like, oh no, the person who's in physical pain, we want to really revel in this physical pain. But no, you're like reveling in, and again, it's my I will just defend to the grave, like, this is a well-structured screenplay, like, of Paxton. Like, you're dealing with like Paxton's emotions and his like visceral reaction to having to do this thing that he doesn't want to do, but also feels like he has to do, that she wants him to do. And it's just like, that's so much, for me, it's so much more visceral than seeing like the rest of, you know, the look on the person's face who's having to go through this. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. So that's my that's my pitch for why there's not as much gore in one of the most gory movies.
Well, I remember when we first saw this movie in theaters together, like not long after we started dating, because I remember I was still in college and I went to St. Louis and watched it, probably with you and Christian, actually.
Yeah.
But all I had heard about the movie was that the director of Cabin Fever had a new movie coming out, and that it was supposed to be one of the goriest movies ever made. And I had liked Cabin Fever pretty well, but I remember my response to Cabin Fever was like, this is pretty good, but I feel like I'm more excited about what he's going to do next, because it feels a little like, not amateurish, but like a little fanboy or something.
It's a little campy, I think, but like I rather enjoy the camp. But no, I get what you're saying.
But yeah, so I was excited to go see it, and the person who told me about it had really emphasized that it was going to be like super, super gory. So I went in really expecting that. And actually at the end of the movie, I was like, really, is that all? And I've always kind of felt that way, that this movie that has this reputation for just being so over the top violent is really, like you said, like a lot of it happens off camera. Like, I think it's really not, it's good PR. Like, it was good marketing to that idea exists in the world, but I don't think the movie actually holds up to that expectation.
I think it holds up to the expectation if you're dealing with thinking about like the violence it is forcing you to consider. I think is much, much more extreme than anything that had come than a lot of things I say that theatrically had come before it that had been in wide release. But the actual gore on screen, I don't know.
There's even a moment where Paxton is getting dragged to the room where he's going to be killed, where they think he's going to be killed. And he's seeing, it's sort of this big reveal where he's getting dragged past all these different torture rooms, and he's seeing into them. I even think that scene is like Eli Roth easily could have held on each of those individual rooms like a half second longer. They go by really fast. You can't even tell what's going on in there. And so like really reveling in the torture is, if that was the intention, he did a bad job, because like there's opportunity to really revel in it that he just doesn't take.
Hey, it's Norm interrupting my own show to bring you up to speed on Shiny Things, my newsletter about physical media, culture, and the odd streaming project. Last week, I wrote about the new releases of Exuma and A Quiet Place Day 1, and Criterion's 4K double feature of Val Lewton's 40s productions I Walked with a Zombie and The Seventh Victim. Sign up for a 14-day free trial at shiny-things.ghost.io or find a link at the Semcast Blue Sky account. You like reading about movies? I like writing about them. Come check it out. It's about the insinuation, right? The whole film is. I mean, it's what Hooper did in Chainsaw that everybody misses in the sequels. You don't see much. What you do see is so fast and so blurry, just with motion, that your brain fills in a much, much uglier image. And I think the look of Hostel, the fact that it is a pretty slick-looking production, that it looks like it cost twice what it did, and all the money is in the effects, but the effects are, they're used judiciously. And we are, I think, responding to the cruelty of the actions rather than the graphic depiction of that cruelty. And I think that's why it works. I think it is because, the origin of the thing is Harry Knowles telling Tarantino a story about the depraved things he saw on the dark web, and then Tarantino and Roth nerding out over it and coming up with a treatment overnight or something. And it's just like this straight line of, dudes rock yelling at each other. The entirety of that cinematic movement is in those three guys. And we get the thing that comes out of it, which is therefore the most extreme because Tarantino and Roth wouldn't stop talking about it for a year. So the buildup was there and the expectation was there. And it's merciless in its infliction of cruelty on people. But yeah, it's certainly not, the sequel is a lot messier by design. I think like Roth took that with the whole, he took the reaction to the first film with, oh, you think that was bad? Wait until you see what I'm going to do now. And then just anteed up.
One of the things I kept thinking about while watching the movie this time was how much it reminded me of it reminds me, I think that he was sort of trying to make a Brian De Palma movie. And I couldn't stop thinking about what Hostel would be like if it had been a spec script and Brian De Palma came on as director, and how it would have been largely very similar, but so much more stylish. Even I kept thinking about the score of the movie, which I think is a really good score, but I like things to be a bit bombastic, and I don't think it's a bombastic score. I think it's a good score in that it doesn't draw a ton of attention to itself. But if De Palma had directed it, it could have been almost the exact same score, but just like the production level of it or something would have been different, and it would have really amplified things in a more operatic and ridiculous way. I think Eli Roth does a good job of I think he's smart with where to place the camera and things like that, but he doesn't do it in a way that draws attention to itself. He's a more classical filmmaker, whereas De Palma is a more showy filmmaker. Even subject matter wise, it's almost like a cross between Dress to Kill and Redacted.
And body doubles in there too, right?
Yeah. And so I have heard it described as somewhat Hitchcockian, but I actually think that it's more like a De Palma movie. And I think it actually would have been a really good De Palma movie, but I don't think it would have been as successful.
I wonder. There'd be a lot more split screens, a lot more violins.
Which he did do in Hostel 2. There's a split screen a sequence in it whenever it's showing all the guys bidding on.
Oh yes,
it's showing the behind the
scenes,
how the hunters get the prey, and then it's just bidding on their cell phones.
Yeah.
Again, way too much backstory. I think it's actually more effective in the first film where this place just exists. And the business card is the only thing we ever see of their organization. You can't help it, right? Because Hostel Part 2 has to answer all the dangling questions from Hostel 1. Right. But the idea of just blundering into this thing, that's my other favorite. That's Texas Chainsaw. That's a million other Cabin in the Woods, what have you, stories where they may not be good people, but they are innocents as far as the world is concerned, the world of the film. And just wandering in the Grudge House, you go in, you're cursed. It doesn't matter if you meant to. It's just where you are now. And this is one of those perfect bear traps in the film that it's just there waiting. And anybody who's dumb enough to wander over gets it.
Something that I was thinking about watching it now, when, again, it's almost 20 years since the movie came out, is that there's this innocence lost that I can still remember from the first viewing of it, where they did a good job with the marketing, because you didn't know what the movie was about really. And so I remember the first viewing of it, it starts with just somebody's washing down a room and whistling, and you just see this viscera going down a drain, and you just hear that creepy whistling, and you're like, okay, is this a serial killer? I remember thinking it was going to be a movie about a serial killer. Mm-hmm. And then they meet the Dutch businessman in the train, so it seems like he's going to be the serial killer, and then you really think that it is him, but then you realize, oh no, it's a whole lot of killers, and oh, it's even worse. it's capitalism just as a serial killer effectively. And I I really value having had that experience of not knowing anything about the movie going into it, because that was a really fun guessing game that I got to play the first time watching it, which I obviously can never have again. But yeah, it's nice to like thinking back on it though, and remembering that, oh yeah, there was that element of it too, that like sort of like who done it of it. Yeah.
I mean, my favorite thing about the film is the public condemnation from Slovakia and the Czech Republic that followed.
That's fair. That's fair.
But I also I think that it's a weird position, because I also do buy Eli Roth's argument, which was basically like, well, I'm not actually saying anything about Slovakia. Like it's more about Americans who like it makes me wonder, like, if he had just made up a country's name and called it like Uzbakia or something,
right.
like, and would I have noticed? Like, there's that John Oliver thing where he'll say the name of a country and then put up an image of just a country, and then he'll be like, and you know so little about it that you don't even realize that that's not the country I'm talking about. That's a map of the state of Alabama or something.
Yeah.
And like that's really is like, I don't know anything about Slovakia. I certainly, when I was however old I was, 22 in 2006 or whenever it came out, I certainly didn't know anything about Slovakia. And I do think that it's totally fair. And like that gets into that, I like the idea that horror is often, just a hair away from satire, like you're dealing with the same sort of impulses there. And I think that a good way to satirize American just kind of mindset, especially in that era of like post 9/11, everybody's angry at George Bush, but also like none of us know what's going on in Slovakia. Like, I think that that's a really good, like, sort of just satirical needling of that impulse in Americans. Now, could it also be indicative of American ignorance that he did this? Like, maybe. I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive necessarily.
Yeah, I think it's a commentary on the ignorance rather than his own ignorance directly, and the sense that, yeah, also it's a weird thing, right? Because you can pick anywhere in the world, but if you have white Americans and Jay Rodriguez is Latino, but if you have white passing Americans being tortured and murdered, you have to have white people doing it. So that limits you. It has to be Europe, or, I mean, I don't think you could get away with Hostel Canada yet. Give us 10 years. We're not there yet. But the idea too that like in the post-communism, energized capitalism, whatever you want to call that period in Russia, where the former Soviet Union breaks up and people are scrambling to provide services that no one else will provide so they can get a big infusion of cash. It does make sense. Like now I keep thinking you could restage this in, I don't know, Wales or the north of England. In some places it's been hit really, really hard by Brexit and the collapse of the UK economy. There's got to be a way to, and there's probably 5 movies about it already that just haven't come out yet, where, the tiny economies, tiny villages are turning to extreme measures. And it does make a certain kind of sense that this would be happening in Eastern Europe, as opposed to, like, they don't go to Barcelona, they go to Slovakia. And Barcelona, Amsterdam, those are quote unquote safe places. But that also plays into the prejudice of an American audience watching this film, identifying with these poor hapless idiots who go to the wrong place because Americans inevitably, and I'm speaking as a dual citizen, inevitably, we never see ourselves as the bad guys. We're the bad guys a lot, but we never perceive ourselves that way.
Yeah, and that's another thing that I think Rachel was kind of getting at this earlier, talking about how he implicates the viewer. But, and that it's something that we played with in our movie as well, where, like this idea of, it's one of the things that I've always loved about Rachel's writing in general, is that she, especially with her horror screenplays, she never lets the victims off the hook for their complicity in their own victimhood. And there's one thing that, there's a scene in our movie where, we've been essentially people who are dealing with some mysterious sort of haunting. But then about, what is it, like 2/3 of the way through the movie, then there's a scene where we're the ones who are effectively haunting somebody else. And it's suddenly like, oh no, have I been rooting for the wrong people this whole time? And it's like, I just think as in horror movies, like you just need to be able to do that. You need to like be like, oh no, I'm the bad guy. Like it should make you feel bad for watching it. Like you should be punished for watching the movie.
Well, yeah, and I mean, Hostel, I think it works both ways. If you're a bro who's like identifying with these characters, you're getting punished. If you're a person who's like, I hate these characters and I can't wait for them to horrible things to befall them, and the horrible things that befall them are so much worse than you would have wanted or could have stomached, like you're getting punished as well. But yeah, I was gonna go somewhere else with that, and then I got so excited to say my thought. Alas,
it'll come back around.
Thanks.
It always does. I was gonna say Man Bites Dog. Like that's the one for me where you are absolutely not let off the hook in that film. That movie is designed to get you to that scene and point the camera at the audience and indict you. And I mean, I remember seeing that at a press screening for TIFF actually in '92, which was like the single greatest Midnight Madness lineup ever. But that was the anchor. And the whole room, maybe 20 people, just kind of went, ugh, just like shocked into silence. Not that we were enjoying the scene, but that extra step is just the moment where it's like, no, it's not safe for you to watch these movies. It's not like you're not a good citizen by being on the other side of the screen. You're still part of this.
Yeah. Okay. I know. and it relates. I know where I was going with this. We don't care, Nick and I, much for horror movies. I feel like there's a lot sort of coming out lately, and we don't care for horror movies that really want to like signal like this is a good person. Like don't worry, you need to root for these people because like they've got a dog that they love, and I don't know, they're a good mom or like whatever. Like I don't care for like I don't need to be like I'm rooting for this person because look how wonderful they are. Like you're rooting for when bad things happen to someone, you're rooting for them because they're a human being. You don't want bad things to happen to a human being.
And it's not just horror movies.
In general.
I remember that was my biggest criticism of what's the movie Gravity? The
Sandra
Bullock space movie. That movie, I only saw it the once, but I was really put off by. I want to say it keeps giving these little flashbacks of her life on Earth with her daughter, and I was like, don't show me that she has a daughter to make me care that she's lost in space. Like she's a human being that's lost in space. That's enough. Like she could be a serial killer. I would still be like, but how's she gonna get down to Earth? Like that's enough. Like the vastness of space and the thin membrane of a spacesuit. That's all that's separating you from eternal darkness. Like that's enough. I don't need to know that she was a good mother.
Well, and
also,
I just think in general in horror, it's fun to. It's a genre. It may be one of the only genres like at this point where you're allowed to empathize with like people making poor decisions, like and people who aren't terribly admirable. Like I just think it's and I mean this is the thing when somebody is. I think this is another thing why I'm just like no, I do not care for the horror movies where they really want to convince you it's like a good person that these things are happening to, is just because like when bad things happen to us, like we so rarely act nobly. Like I'm not interested in a good person that bad things happen to and but they're still a good person and they're gonna good person their way out of this because good always triumphs. Like that's not a horror movie that I want to see. I want to feel uncomfortable when I'm watching a horror movie, and I don't think when you come out the gate being like, don't worry, you can root for this person, I don't feel like I'm in the hands of somebody who's going to make me feel terror.
Yeah, you want to know a movie that here's the plot of the movie and see if you can name the movie. All right. You've got an admirable hero who a whole bunch of terrible things happen to uh and is just completely eviscerated but comes out the moral victor at the end. The Passion of the Christ. And
He
we don't
does die.
he does die and comes back. But that's not what we want the plot line of horror movies to
Not
be.
not where I want it to go. I'm just a sucker for a complicated, unlikable characters like doing doing bad or good things. I don't know. I prefer a complex character because I think I like to think I'm a complex character who doesn't always make good or smart choices. That's right. And easier. Yeah, I think in a way easier to relate to people doing bad or stupid things, and more fun to relate.
I just don't really want to watch any movies about people doing good things. That just doesn't sound entertaining to me. I want to watch movies about people behaving badly and and acting dumb. Which explains our movie.
It totally explains our movie. That's right. So if you want to see a movie about maybe not so admirable people behaving badly and acting dumb, but hopefully you like us anyway. Some people don't. Go see it. Doesn't get any better than this.
Yeah, and if you want to see a movie about people who are not likable, behaving badly, and only bad things happen and only bad feelings are felt, stay tuned for our next movie, Homebody.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good out, but I still want to ask. Not that I see a direct line, but is there anything in Hostel that you quoted, borrowed, like pulled structurally for your own work? Is there something that you would want to use?
I do think I don't think there was anything overt. I don't think we talked about Hostel at all when we were making the movie, but I do think that generally we did talk overtly about Rob Zombie.
Oh, yeah.
And the way that he approaches his characters, where they're basically whatever's happening on screen when people are acting terrible, they're always really, really excited. And we wanted to we were like, there's a problem that happens in a lot of found footage movies where they can't have these lapses of really low energy. And we wanted to avoid that. And we were like, what if we're just like amped up to 11 all the time and everything that happens, we're just super excited about, especially Rachel. And so that was definitely in the mix. And I feel like Rob Zombie and Eli Roth were sort of drawing from a lot of the same creative like pools. And so I don't think that I do think that some of the approach to characterization, because like we essentially made idiotic grotesqueries of ourselves for our movie, and I think that that's what Eli Roth does with his characters.
I do. I think that's fair. Yeah. Although I feel like, and I mean, look, I don't know the guy, but I do think some of the like, I don't like this guy reaction maybe comes from people just assuming that he's just like this big dumb bro, but I get the impression that he's just like a fellow horror nerd. Like, I don't know.
Well, he's always said that too. Like he was like, I remember there was an interview with him where he talked about how he was like, I don't write characters that are like me. Like me and my friends, we were like basically that we were nerds who wouldn't get into this kind of trouble because we were off like nerding out over movies somewhere together, as opposed to like the braggadocious frat guys who were the kinds of people who had the confidence to go out and get into this kind of situation. So I think that was the kind of character he was interested in. And that was kind of what we did with our movie playing ourselves was we were just like, what is the version of ourselves who believably would be in this situation? Like how can we? And basically what that came down to was like, what if we're just excited every time something scary happens?
Yeah.
Which may or may not be how. I remember at one point Rachel was like, Nick, if somebody really was standing outside of our house and staring at us, what would you do? And I was like, I'd probably call the police. But that may be because of making the movie as opposed.
I don't know. Just one person. I don't know that I would. It's Kirksville.
Well,
Like,
not one person, but if there were like
if we kept seeing one person, I don't know. On the third person.
also even now
person, I don't know.
saying it out loud, I'm still not even sure because like I really don't like calling the police.
It's true. My favorite bad review of our movie was, it is not scary to see people staring at a house. And it's dumb that these people aren't scared of the people staring at our house at two different moments in the review. Like, why aren't they scared of the people staring at a house? And by the way, the people staring at a house aren't scary. That was
my
fun.
favorite bad review of our movie was somebody who said, what did they say? They said, it's all set up and no payoff, but I loved the last 10 minutes.
Wait.
Great. Great.
Do they understand how payoff works?
That was what I wondered, but they just let anyone write anything on these websites now.
My thanks to Rachel Kempf and Nick Toti, whose very clever and really effective new horror movie, It Doesn't Get Any Better Than This, is screening in St. Louis at the Arcadon Cinema on Friday, October 18th, at Aorta in Kirksville on Saturday the 19th, and at the Grand Illusion in Seattle on October 25th. Thanks also to Peter Kaplowski. He knows what he did. You can find Rachel and Nick online and keep track of upcoming screenings of their movie at diediebooks.com. And check out their work in publishing, too. It's pretty cool. And you can find Hostel on Blu-ray and DVD from Sony Pictures Home Entertainment. It was subsequently reissued as a double feature with Hostel Part 2 by Mill Creek Entertainment. It's also streaming on Crave in Canada and Starz in the US, and available to rent or buy on various VOD services across North America. You can find me on Blue Sky at Norm Wilner, and you can find this podcast there at Semcast, S-E-M-Cast, and on the web at someoneelsesmovie.com. The first year of the show is still available for just $20 at payhip.com/Semcast. That's the first 52 episodes of Someone Else's Movie, 44 of which aren't currently available anywhere else. And check out my newsletter, Shiny Things, at shiny-things.ghost.io. I think you'll enjoy it. Our theme song is by The Last Year. If you like it, or the show in general, please say so. Leave a review wherever you've been listening. Every little bit helps, it really does. And check out the other shows on the Frequency Podcast Network while you're doing that. Stay safe, watch movies, wear a mask if you go out, and get the new booster as soon as you can. I'll see you next week.